Reluăm lucrările comisiei.
Let us resume our committee's work then, colleagues. Might I request silence in the meeting room? Our next item on the agenda is item 15, Petition 161/2006 from Dan Brennan. And this petition is on pollution in Kilkenny, Ireland, and on the problems experienced by local livestock farmers. Do you have the floor, sir?
Dear members, thank you for your invitation here today. My name is Dan Brennan, the farmer that owns the farm adjacent to Armour and Brick factory in County Kilkenny. The reason that I brought the petition firstly was that our cattle were growing at half the national average. Sometimes all our cattle would lose weight over a period of a month or two. We also had a milk loss of 30% and the environment on our farm was severely damaged. My farm has been under investigation since December 2002 and numerous reports have been written by the Irish authorities. The last report carried out on the farm was by University College Dublin under the instructions from the Department of Agriculture, and it took 3 years to complete. The report states that the problems are multifactorial in nature but are unable to list these factors. At a meeting in January 2012 with the researchers told us that they were not aware that Armour and Brick was emitting cadmium. They said that they had no answers to what happened on our farm. They are fully aware, since the factory closed, that our farm has improved dramatically. Also, at that meeting was brought up about the 06 Department of Agriculture report. They are aware that the 06 report is flawed, but still they allowed it to be published. Basically, and they have no answers, and that the factory is closed now, and there is a massive improvement on the farm. Thanks.
Alături de noi se află și reprezentanții ai Ministerului Agriculturii.
Thank you. We have here some representatives from the Agricultural Ministry in Ireland. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Michael Sheridan.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to thank you and your committee for this opportunity to allow the Irish authorities to present their understanding of the various reports investigating the problems affecting Mr. Brennan's farm. By way of introduction, as you say, my name is Michael Sheridan. I'm the Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer of the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine in Ireland. I have with me on my left Mr. Kieran O'Brien, who is Programme Manager with the Environmental Protection Agency in Ireland. And on my right is Professor Simon Moore, who holds the Chair of Veterinary Epidemiology in University College Dublin, is also Director of the Centre for Veterinary Epidemiology and Risk Analysis. And this is the body that carried out the report that Mr. Brennan has just referred to between 2007 and 2009. The issues I'd like to address, a number of issues have been raised at previous meetings, and in particular, Madam Chairman, we would like to answer the issues raised in your letter to the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, Mr. Brendan Smith, in February of 2010, in which the proper implementation of the Integrated Pollution Prevention Control Directive in Ireland was questioned in regard to the local brick factory, and the concern of the committee at reports that extremely high levels of cadmium had been found in stunted animals on the farm. And two, in your recent letter of invitation to the current Minister for Agriculture, Mr. Simon Coveney, TD, for us to attend this meeting, you have stated that the majority view of your committee is that the problems on Mr. Brennan's farm result from pollution generated by the local brick factory. In addition, you have suggested that the time correlation between the poor performance on the farm and the times when the factory has been operating is significant. Now, I'll provide a brief summary of the state supports provided in the investigations to Mr. Brennan's farm problems. I will then address the cadmium issue. Mr. O'Brien will address the questions relating to the operating licence of Ormond Brick and the extensive monitoring of emissions that have taken place. and Professor Moore will address the questions of the burden of proof required in these types of epidemiological investigations and the correlation between animal performance and factory operating time. I hope that the findings and interpretations of the various competent authorities that have looked at these issues will provide perspective and assist you in your task of hearing the particular petition. Now, just to give you an idea of how the investigations are conducted in Ireland, the production problems on the farm, as Dan said, were brought to our attention at the end of 2002. We began investigating locally at the Regional Veterinary Laboratory in 2003. A number of post-mortems and routine investigations were undertaken. It was suggested that emissions from the factory could be playing a role in poor performance, and the investigation was immediately widened to include possible environmental factors, including industrial pollution. A standard protocol, known as the Interagency Protocol, was implemented in 2004 to ensure full coordination between the various agencies of the state that have responsibility for different aspects of such an environmental investigation. In this instance, the agencies involved were the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, the Regional Veterinary Laboratory Service, CHOGAS, which is the National Agriculture and Food Development Authority, in terms of assessing and advising on the farm production systems and undertaking soil surveys and herbage analysis, the Environment Protection Agency, in terms of the licensing of the brick factory and the monitoring of the emissions from the factory, the Health Service Executive, in terms of investigating claims that human health had been adversely affected in the area, and finally Kilkenny County Council, who as the local authority have responsibility for the quality of local drinking water and have a detailed knowledge of everything in the area. All investigations carried out since 2004 have been under the supervision and guidance of the interagency group. All reports produced by the individual agencies or commissioned by them are subject to full internal peer review before publication. The collective report of this interagency group, which summarises the findings of a series of investigations carried out by or commissioned by the various agencies of the state in the period 2003 to 2009, was published in August of 2010. It's a short summary of a number of reports and a document that should be particularly helpful to you. I know that your time as a busy committee is scarce and that individual reports such as the Severa report that Simon Moore was responsible for, alone, that runs to more than 800 pages. So if you read nothing else, then I recommend you read the summary report, which runs to just 12 pages. Having considered the findings of each of the agency contributions to the investigation, the following are the overall conclusions of the interagency group, and I'll just mention them very briefly. There was no evidence to indicate that environmental pollution caused ill thrift and poor growth in the animals. There was no evidence that cadmium or fluoride were involved in the ill health. Problems on the index farm were likely to have been multifactorial in origin. A number of common disease conditions which could account for much of the occurrence and severity of poor animal performance were identified. In addition, quite a difficult mineral deficiency problem was also elucidated. CHOGAS investigations conclude that while the soils on the index farm were difficult to farm, the nutrient status of the soil and herbage was not radically different to other farms in Ireland, so there wasn't anything particularly wrong with the land and the herbage on the farm. And finally, the Health Service Executive did not identify any increase in human illness or unusual patterns of human illness in the area. Now, that's the overall summary of the work done by the state agencies. In the letters that I've mentioned and in the previous thing, there has been specific mention of excessive cadmium levels being the specific cause of the problem, and I'd like to address that. It's a slightly complex story, so bear with me on this. Cadmium, as you know, is found in nature at low background levels. It can also arise at higher levels from industrial pollution, giving rise to animal health and human health problems. And at higher levels again, cadmium can cause severe toxicological effects. You've been told that exceptionally high cadmium levels were found in the animals on Mr. Brennan's farm and that this is the cause of the stunting. Well, this is simply not true. The story regarding cadmium, as I say, is complex. We had initially seen slightly raised cadmium levels on the farm in the kidneys of animals that were post-mortemed. We had also received a report from Mr. Crilly, who is here today, of cadmium levels found in the soil on the gutters of one of the metal sheds in the farmyard, and this had slightly raised cadmium levels. The view of the Environmental Protection Agency was that these were not significant in themselves but warranted further investigation. So we were asked to do this. It was undertaken as part of the Severa study in 2007, and there were 3 separate investigations. In the first instance, some 2,300 blood samples that had been taken from animals on the farm and elsewhere at 2-week intervals during 2007 were subject to a full heavy metal screening to see if the animals had been exposed to cadmium or other heavy metals. A comprehensive soil and grass analysis was undertaken on the farm and adjoining areas. This was the most comprehensive such survey ever undertaken on an Irish farm. And 3 kidneys of various animals were sampled as they were culled for slaughter, and these were then subject to further analysis. Now, with the bloods, the 2,300 blood samples were, as part of a library, a sub-sample of these was taken, and a preliminary process was carried out in acid digestion to prepare them before they were sent to a German laboratory for analysis. When the results came back, 600 out of the 2,300 samples had a very high, excessively high level of cadmium reported. The other 1,800 or so, or 1,700 samples were normal or slightly raised background normal levels. Now, when we looked at this, we did a very detailed examination of it, and it turned out that the laboratory had made an error. They had made a mistake, they had caused a cross-contamination error. I'll give you just 2 proofs on this, and there is a full report on it outlining what happened, an addendum report. The 2 proofs I will give you are that there were animals on a farm 70 miles away which had the same results. The second is when we looked at these results, the positive results all emerged at a point in time in the laboratory as the samples were processed that afternoon at 2 o'clock. The positive results occurred at that point and sequentially thereafter. The final proof is that the commercial laboratory that carried out this examination and this error put their hands up and said, yes, we made a mistake. The error is ours. So when the party who actually is responsible for the error admits it publicly and takes part, signs their name to the report that says that they made a mistake, then I put it to you that the laboratory made a mistake and that these excessively high levels are not relevant. The second issue that arose was background levels, raised background levels of cadmium. These we discussed with an expert from the European Food Safety Authority, and he advised that we should look further into this, and we did, and I'll mention that in a second. The other thing that we did were the two surveys that were mentioned on the soil and the herbage, and we found no evidence of cadmium deposition or excess cadmium in the soil or the herbage. So if there was pollution coming from the factory, it did not land on the soil or the herbage. The last point that I would make on the cadmium is that last year we carried out a survey of cadmium levels in Irish cattle on foot of the advice from this expert from the European Food Safety Authority. And the results of that showed that the levels of kidney cadmium in Mr. Brennan's cattle are no different to about 25 to 30% of the animals in the rest of Ireland. There is a slightly raised background level found in this survey. The report was submitted to the Food Safety Authority of Ireland about 2 weeks ago and has been forwarded to the Commission and will be part of an overall debate on cadmium levels in Europe, which is going on at the moment. But the key point is that the levels found in the rest of the cattle in Ireland, on 25–30%, they are no different from those found in Mr. Brennan's farm. So cadmium, whatever else may be causing problems on Mr. Brennan's farm, cadmium is not the issue. Now, I have finished that. I will hand over to Mr. Kieran O'Brien, who will deal with the questions that were raised in regard to the brick factory, and at the end I might come back, as I say, for just a minute to summarise.
Thank you. I'll just deal with the licensing of the local brick factory and outline the agency's enforcement of this and our interaction in relation to the interagency investigation. The Irish EPA is an independent statutory body and was established in 1993 and has a wide range of functions and responsibilities in Ireland, including monitoring and reporting on the state of the environment, overseeing local authorities' environmental responsibilities, coordinating environmental research in Ireland, promoting resource efficiency and regulating Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions. The regulation of large-scale industry and waste facilities is also under our remit. The EPA has a specific number of defined roles in relation to licensing and enforcement of industrial activities under the IPPC directive. The Ormond Brick company, the initial company was established in 1968 and became Ormond Brick in 1988. And the only product manufactured on site is facing brick. Activities declined from approximately 1999 and ceased operations in December 2008. The EPA granted an IPC licence to Ormond Brick in 2001 with regard to the IPPC directive and the application of best available techniques. The IPPC directive was not transposed into Irish legislation at the time of the licence, and an amendment was issued in 2006 to include accident prevention, energy use and clarification on monitoring of HCl and HF methods and including additional flexibility. The licence provided for the control of emissions, including emission limit values for relevant parameters based on materials used and the processes carried out. The emission limit values were set to ensure no significant environmental pollution occurred, and this was based on modelling and national ambient air quality standards and German TIA Luft air quality standards. EPA enforcement of the Ormond Brick facility included site inspections, emission monitoring and environmental audits, with multiple site visits each year. The EPA was initially contacted in March 2003 regarding animal health problems at Mr Dan Brennan's farm, and the EPA were invited to participate in an interagency investigation led by the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. The EPA investigations focused on atmospheric emissions and potential impacts on air quality or potential pollution deposits on farmland. The main potential pollutant in atmospheric emissions from Ormond Brick is fluoride, released from the clays during firing of the bricks. And the following issues were assessed in support of the interagency investigation: emissions from the factory, process events, production records, raw material assessments, air dispersion modelling, ambient air monitoring, soil and grass monitoring, a lichen survey, a tree survey, water, surface water and groundwater monitoring, and potential emissions including heavy metals, dioxins and PAHs. In particular, in relation to cadmium, the raw materials were analysed for cadmium, and the results indicated very low levels of cadmium in the raw materials, with negligible losses of cadmium to the atmosphere from the process. Emission monitoring for cadmium was carried out in 2004 and 2005, and monitoring results in 2004 were not consistent, with average results of 0.5 milligrams per cubic metre. This is in the range of the type of emission that would be controlled from glass manufacturing, which would be approximately in the same range. And subsequent monitoring in 2005 did not indicate any significant cadmium emissions. The EPA also carried out dispersion modelling on cadmium dispersions, including deposition in dust, and also found that there was no significant impact associated with cadmium emissions from the Ormond Brick factory. And this modelling was based on the worst case monitoring data that was obtained in early 2004. Results from grass and soil analysis for cadmium were within typical expected ranges for Ireland, suggesting no significant cadmium deposition. The EPA has concluded from this that the cadmium emissions from the Ormond Brick Limited have not resulted in any significant environmental impact in the vicinity of the installation. In 2007, the agency engaged a panel of international experts, including UK Environment Agency, the US EPA, ex-UK Environment Agency air expert and industrial expert to conduct a peer review of the operations of Ormond Brick Limited and the EPA's regulation of it. The project included site visits to Ormond Brick Limited, as well as a review of the enforcement and licence application files. The overall review found that the EPA had characterised emissions in accordance with a best regulatory practice, responded effectively to concerns about the possible environmental impacts, and carried out an extensive amount of well-focused work to characterise, monitor and minimise air emissions from the factory. The conclusions from the EPA investigations are summarised in the interagency report on investigations of animal health problems on the farm near Castlecomer, and they include, as already stated, the results of extensive environmental and animal investigations have found no evidence to indicate that environmental pollution caused ill thrift or poor growth rates in animals on the index farm. And there is no evidence that cadmium or fluoride were involved in ill health of animals on the index farm. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I wish to cover two issues briefly. The first one relates to the approach that we use to assess available evidence, and the second one to our assessment of the factory as a contributor to the problems. Our work, and I refer to the 2009 report, included some primary research, but mainly related to the assembly and the critical evaluation at that time of all available data. We looked at 15 studies. There were 15 studies available, some that we had undertaken, some undertaken by the Irish government, and some independent work. And also there were 7 supporting analyses that were done. And fundamentally, the key question that we sought to answer was there evidence in support of any of the following hypotheses? Hypotheses specific to the farm, management, nutrition, genetics, animal health concerns, and also hypotheses that were not specific, essential element deficiencies and environmental pollution. And the question for each was, could that particular hypothesis explain the observed problem that Dan has faced? Each hypothesis and all of the data that was available relevant to that hypothesis was evaluated against international criteria known as the Bradford Hill criteria. And these are criteria that are appropriate for seeking to understand, to test and to see if there's cause that could be attributed to each of those hypotheses I mentioned. The next point I think is important for the committee, and that is that as cases become complex and as more data become available, it's common for there to be some uncertainty about the conclusions, because some data are in support, but some data are not in support of each of these hypotheses. So in the face of that uncertainty, the approach that we took, which is equivalent to the approach taken in terms of the issue of climate change as well, and many other issues where there is the potential for uncertainty, is to look at evidence against burden of proof. So we have a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 being there is absolutely no evidence in support of that hypothesis, through to 10 being there is absolutely no doubt that that hypothesis is true. A score of 5 is equivalent to a civil case on the balance of probabilities, and a score of 9 to a criminal case beyond reasonable doubt. And in our work, we set a burden of proof to 5, equivalent to that used in a civil case on the balance of probabilities. So that was the methodology that we used. I'd like to now turn to the possibility of the factory being a cause or a contributor to the poor performance that Dan has had with his cattle. And we had information from essentially from 10 different sources. The first one relates to events over time, factory open, factory closed, and I will come back to that in a moment. 4 were general studies, some undertaken by the EPA, some by other independent scientists. There were 2 studies looking specifically at fluorine, and 3 studies specifically at cadmium. And as with all of these hypotheses, we started with a score of 0, that being there's no evidence in support of the hypothesis, and then we started to look at all of the evidence. And with respect to factory as potential cause, we ended with a score of about 2 or 3, 2 being possible, 3 being plausible, backed by some evidence. And this is based on the data that was available to us in mid-2009. In other words, there was only weak evidence in support of the factory being a contributor, and it certainly wasn't to a score of 5, which I mentioned was the threshold that we were evaluating against. And in most of those 10 studies, there was no evidence in support of the hypothesis at all. Finally, I turn to our interpretation of the data relating to the times the factory was open and the factory was closed. And I do remind you that our work relates to our understanding in mid-2009, although I will come to later periods later. And during 2003 to 2008, which was the period of our study, the factory was closed for 2 relatively short periods, early 2007 and early 2008 approximately. And during these periods of closure, animal performance certainly was good. However, the problem that we face is that the problem occurs sporadically, and animal performance was also good for some of the periods that the factory was open. And therefore, based on that evidence alone, there's very little that you can actually draw about this observation in terms of the factory being the contributor to the problem. Now, we appreciate that it was really important to measure animal performance once the factory closed in 2008, and my staff have repeatedly offered our assistance to Dan to do this, to which he's consistently declined. Milk recording data that has been collected in the last several years nonetheless highlight a substantial improvement in milk volume in recent years. But as yet, we have no robust data about animal growth rates, apart from the performance of calves in 2009, which is the year after the factory closed. And in that year, there was no objective improvement that was observed. I can't comment upon data in 2010, 11 and 12 because I don't have it. My final comment is I do caution that this event over time data, that is what is happening when the factory is open and when the factory is closed, if it were positive, would be unlikely on its own to push the burden of proof to 5 or beyond. Other supporting evidence would also be required. On its own, this event over time data, this factory open, factory closed data, does not control for all of the other things that could have changed in this locality during this 5 to 10 year period. Thank you.
În continuare dau cuvântul Comisiei Europene, domnul Keir McAndrew.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. I'm now going to call the Commission to comment.
Sorry, Mr. Sheridan wanted to.
Da, domnul Sheridan.
Madam Chair, I wish just to take one more minute of your time, if I may, and it was to try and put some semblance of order on this. You've heard significant differences of opinion as to the interpretation of the findings of the various reports undertaken or commissioned by the interagency group at previous hearings. You have stated in your letter of invitation that the majority view of the committee is that pollution generated by the brick factory is the likely cause of the problem. We are saying today that the evidence does not support this opinion, but the remedy that you have available to you, if I may suggest this, the remedy you have available to you in your endeavours as neutral, non-scientific observers trying to understand these conflicting statements is to refer these reports to the EU Commission and specifically ask they be referred to from DG Sanco by referral to one or other of the expert bodies available to the Commission, such as the Joint Research Council or the European Food Safety Authority. The Irish authorities and the authors of the various reports would be happy to discuss the reports in details with such an EU expert body, and in this way the Petitions Committee would have an independent expert opinion available to advise its own conclusions on what is a very complex issue. I recommend this approach to you. Thank you very much for listening to us.
Dau în continuare cuvântul petiționarului.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor to the petitioner for any additional comments.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of points on the issues raised by the department. I don't think the EPA were very transparent in the cadmium emissions levels that they recorded from the factory. I didn't actually hear anything much, something about brick, glass. The reality is that in April 2004, the EPA found 24 grams per hour of cadmium being emitted, which is 160 times greater than the TA Luft guidelines for all Class 1 carcinogens, including cadmium. The guidelines are 0.15 grams. The recorded emissions were 24 grams. Now, maybe you picked that up from what the EPA said, but I certainly didn't. So when they conclude that there was no evidence of cadmium emissions from the factory that could have affected Dan's cattle, that's incorrect. The other thing is they talked about the bloods. And there is no doubt that 200 and something blood samples from that farm were contaminated by cadmium in an EPA-approved laboratory. But before those bloods became contaminated, blood samples from the farm were found to have up to 200 parts per billion of cadmium in them. Potentially toxic levels in humans are 10. Before the contamination event, they found up to 200 in Dan's cattle. After the event, 6 months after, in December, they found an animal with 400 parts per million of cadmium in it. I don't think that was clear from the deposition from the Department of Agriculture. They did find potentially toxic levels of cadmium in Dan's cattle, in the blood, irrespective of the contamination event. And we would have to ask ourselves how 250 blood samples got contaminated with pure cadmium in an approved laboratory. Cadmium is not something you have lying about in a laboratory bench. But that happened during their watch. There's also, subsequent to that event, another 2 sets of samples disappeared. Nobody knows where. The researchers took samples 2 months later. They were never examined because they lost them. All the silage samples from the farms were lost. The Commission will tell you that the factory were compliant. They were told that they had an independent assessment of the way the factory was run, and they did some well-focused work on reducing their emissions. They neglected to tell you that well-focused work was done with an online fluoride monitor that was miscalibrated to underread fluoride emissions by a factor of 2. So they were reporting that we've improved our emission levels, and subsequently the EPA themselves went in and said, we want to independently verify the calibration of your fluoride monitor. And it had been misreading for the past 3 years. It had been misreading. It was getting 21 and it was reading it as 10. And I don't think that came across in the presentation. So maybe that's enough for me at the moment. Thank you.
Normal ar fi fost să vă dau cuvântul la sfârșitul dezbaterii.
Well, I should have given you the floor at the end of the debate, but I will give the floor to the second petitioner.
To come back as well on Michael Sheridan, because he correctly said there were 4 conclusions arising from the interagency report. And he mentioned the Chagas investigation in particular, which concluded that, and he's correct in saying that while the soils on the index farm were difficult to farm, the nutrient status of soil and herbage was not radically different from that found on many farms in Ireland. What he failed to say was that general farm practices were not dissimilar. to those found on many farms in Ireland. In other words, farm practices on Dan Brennan's farm were not responsible for what was observed. He also mentioned that the Health Service Executive investigations did not identify any increase of human illness or unusual patterns of human illness in the area. The Health Service Executive never visited Dan Brennan's farm, never interviewed his family, or never obtained their medical records. Thank you.
Mai dorește unul dintre petiționari să ia cuvântul? Dacă nu vom...
Do any other petitioners want to take the floor? Otherwise, we will move to the Commission.
Madam Chairman, can I have a quick word, please? I just want... Sorry.
Este a doua oară când mă întrerupeți. Trecem la comisie și veți avea cuvântul la sfârșit.
Well, so we will give the floor to the Commission first, and then you'll have the floor afterwards.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will talk a little bit about the investigation that the Commission has undertaken with regards to the brick factory and the performance of the brick factory in comparison to the Integrated Pollution Prevention and Control Directive of 1996. That directive, commonly abbreviated to the IPPC directive, requires that installations that fall within its scope implement the best available techniques to prevent and minimise emissions. And the directive covers a whole broad spectrum of industries, including ceramics manufacturer, and including, in this particular case, the brick factory in question. Now, the Commission has been to the Petitions Committee on a few occasions to talk about its findings. And it's probably best if I try and summarise the findings of our assessment of the permit and of the monitoring data that we have received to date. Our first comparison is, of course, between the permit conditions for the brick factory and what we would recognise at a European level as being the same as best available techniques. And for this, we have what is known as a Best Available Techniques reference document, also known as a BREF, which contains the typical emissions that you would expect to see through the application of best available techniques. So our first comparison was between that BAT reference document and the permit. And what we found in that comparison is that the permit were generally in line with what would be classed as BAT. And that has previously been indicated to this committee. The next round of investigation has been based on monitoring data, comparing the monitoring data provided with the permit conditions themselves. And what has been found in the most recent investigation is that there have been, between the period 2001 and 2006, certain breaches of permit conditions. They relate in particular to emissions of fluorides, where permit conditions were breached on 10 occasions, for chlorides on 4 occasions, for particulates on 2 occasions, and for nitrogen oxides on 1 occasion. Information collected by the Irish authorities identified a number of corrective actions for the brick factory to address those permit non-compliances. Now, having looked at the permit, having looked at the non-compliances with the permit and the actions taken by the Irish authorities, what we cannot identify under the IPPC directive for the permit is a breach of that directive.
Up to 2006?
The information that we have examined is 2001 to 2006 data.
You were provided with information up to 2008.
O să aveți cuvântul la sfârșit.
So on the basis of the information that we have assessed, that we have received, the non-compliances are as I have laid out. One further consideration to have in mind is that the IPPC directive only came fully into force across the European Union from the 30th of October 2007. I will leave my intervention there. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
În continuare, voi da cuvântul doamnei Prendergast.
Well, I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Prendergast.
Madam Chair, I think the need to find a solution to this petition is obvious to everybody here. I think there's also been a lot of confusion in relation to the scientific data and in relation to the various reports that have emerged from a plethora of Irish authorities. With this in mind, Madam Chairperson, I would request that you refer the petition, together with all the scientific data collected and the reports made, to the Joint Research Council in order to get an independent evaluation of the evidence thus far. I think without this independent perspective, it will be very difficult for us as MEPs to come to a reasonable conclusion in relation to the finding of this petition. Thank you, Madam Chair.
În continuare are cuvântul doamna McGuinness.
Thank you. Mrs. McGuinness, please.
Thank you, Chairperson. As you know, I'm no longer a member of this committee, but was a member when Mr. Brennan first came to us. And it's rather unfortunate that this petition has been on our books, if you like, for this length of time without resolution. And, you know, we have every sympathy for Mr. Brennan's plight, and I think the committee support him in trying to find a solution to the problem. Despite all of that negativity, there are two positives from this morning's hearing. I think it is most welcome that we have, I think for the first time, representatives from the Member State to give an account of the measures and efforts taken to date on this case. I think that's very welcome. It's also welcome to hear that things on the farm are better. I think that is particularly welcome. I'm inclined to repeat what I said at the last time we met in Petitions, which is that we do need a scientific intervention on this. You can hear from the two sides, if you like, that there is no agreement even on some of the conclusions that have been reached by the scientific reports in Ireland. There is a great deal of disagreement around the cadmium issue, which has been confused by the contamination story. And I think it would have been helpful had the Commission commented, and perhaps they would, on the proposal, I think by Mr. Sheridan, that this be referred, I would have thought, to the JRC or what other body might be appropriate, to give this committee the wherewithal, if you like, to overlook the evidence such as it is in its totality and to give direction. And I would like the Commission to comment on that as a proposal. I'd also like to hear what Dan Brennan thinks of that proposal, because he came to Europe because he felt he wasn't getting a hearing in the Member State. And if he was supportive of this, I certainly would listen to his perspective on it, because this committee is about the citizen. So if the petitioner is open to this idea, if we get an openness from the Member State to give all of the information and to cooperate fully, and if there is a body that has the resources to do this work, then I think it is the best route to perhaps a conclusion, which I think would be very welcome, because we all know there was a problem. To say that the reasons are multifactorial, perhaps perhaps that is the case, but it doesn't give any succour to the petitioner, and I think that's what we're trying to do here. So perhaps a brief word from the Commission at some point on that proposal, but also I think Mr. Brennan should be asked to give his view about this proposal and to see if he would support it and what caveats there might be to that. Thank you.
Domnule Kelly, aveți cuvântul.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Very much. Firstly, I would just say that I have no personal interest in this because it's outside my constituency. So I'm looking at it from a point of view of the petitioner and his position. And in fairness, it's good that we have both sides here this morning. I am at a loss to know why the state wasn't represented prior to this, and there may be lessons there for future petitions rather than dragging them out that everybody is brought here at the first occasion so we can hear the evidence from both sides. And really this is not about the blame game. This is about trying to find a solution. And looking at it from both points of view, I can see the State's point of view, that they carried out their remit according to their statutory obligations, etc., and comparing evidence across other farms and so forth, maybe they felt that the evidence was inconclusive. But at the same time, to hear that a laboratory erred and that samples disappeared, and that you just kind of dismiss that as saying, OK, sadly we admitted it, unfortunate. At the same time, from the point of view of an individual with a case, that certainly undermines our confidence. And often in situations like this, the state agency or whatever says, OK, we made a mistake and that's the end of it. But if an individual citizen or a farmer makes a mistake, they can be very heavily penalised. So, from the point of view of Dan Brennan, if you look at what happened in his farm, it was logical to assume that it had to have something to do with the factory. Whether that's proved or not proved, it certainly led to an awful lot of trauma for him, and he had an obligation, from his own point of view, to pursue that and to try and get a conclusive answer, which seems difficult to get, but also to get compensation if that was his position. So I think that, as this seems to be almost a one-off, maybe not a one-off, but certainly very exceptional, I would go along with my colleagues, Prendergast and McGuinness, that maybe the Joint Research Council would look at it and make a recommendation. But the burden of proof should not be on the petitioner. The evidence would suggest that certainly he had a case, that if the case was strong and if he suffered, which he did, hugely in terms of both emotionally and financially, that then he should be compensated by somebody or other, whether it's the state or the commission or the insurance or whatever. But certainly, if you put yourself in his shoes, farming in that situation, having this happen to your cattle, having a factory there, factory closes, the situation improves, that's a logical conclusion, and I think from that point of view it should be looked at sympathetically. Thank you very much.
Mr. Walsh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. I think there's a huge problem here, in that it was obvious to me from the very beginning of this case, and I've been involved in it for close on 10 years now, and just to make the committee aware that I farm in the same region as Dan Brennan myself, and I had no doubt from the very beginning of what I saw happening on the farm and the various investigations that were carried out by the department and EPA, etc. there, that the focus of the investigation was totally wrong. From my point of view, from the very beginning, the focus of this investigation was to prove Dan Brennan a bad farmer. They investigated everything on the farm to try and find a problem either with Dan or his animals or his method of farming. And as a farmer who has a reputation, and people can judge for themselves how good or bad that is, but I'm prepared to stand behind the fact that I think Dan Brennan is an exceptionally good farmer, and I know I can bring many of his neighbours here, all of his neighbours here, that will stand up and verify the very same fact. And we are not prepared to let him down. I think the objective of the various reports that have been done by the state agencies have set out to confuse the issue. As Mr Crilly beside me here has pointed out, they have conveniently ignored some of the facts of the case that have been established by themselves. The high levels of various heavy metals that have been found on the farm have been conveniently ignored from time to time. One of the people from the department actually stated earlier here today that production declined in the factory from 1999 and ceased in 2008. Now, everybody here, it's a fact of history at this stage about the building boom in Ireland. Now, I put it to you, Do you think that production in this plant declined from 1999 until 2007? I can tell you quite clearly, and I saw it for myself, that production increased substantially. They were working on 24-hour shifts at one stage during that period, whereas before that they used to only be on normal daily production. Yes, production did decline in 2007 when the financial crisis struck, and production ceased in 2008 when the financial crisis really hit home in Ireland, and building ceased. It's just significant. I said to the lads yesterday evening, we saw 2 cranes on the skyline in Dublin yesterday evening when we were driving to the airport. I haven't seen any cranes on the skyline in Dublin for the last 3 or 4 years. There was a time when you could count them in their hundreds, and that was during the period 1999 to 2007. Now, production did not decline from 1999 to 2007. Production increased, and the problems on the farm increased during that period. It's fantastic to visit the farm today and to see how much the animals have improved, how much production has improved. Dan's milk recording figures will verify that. And I don't blame Dan. I agree with Dan for refusing the department permission to come in on the farm and weigh the animals again, because you don't need to weigh them. The naked eye can see the difference. And it has cost him a fortune, the amount of times he's had to get the animals together for the department to play with them for the last 10 years. Taking blood samples every 2 weeks, weighing them, feeding them different diets to try and prove Dan Brennan a bad farmer. I agree with Dan that he was right to refuse the department permission to weigh them for the last few years. I saw the animals on the farm several times in the last 10 years, and it was obvious there was something affecting them, and there's nothing affecting them now. Even to look at the trees on the farm, you didn't need to be an expert in trees to know back around 2003 and 2004 that there was something affecting the trees. You visit the farm today, the trees are healthy looking. The factory has been closed for the last 4 years. There was, to listen to the statements from some of the contributors here today to say that there was no significant evidence, or there was no evidence of poor growth rates. It's just unbelievable that professional people can make those statements. I have here available to me the full list of thousands of blood samples, which shows, as Mr. Quilly has stated, that some of them had levels way in excess of the accepted permitted levels before any possible contamination could have taken place in the laboratory, and after possible contamination took place in a laboratory, and as Deputy Kelly there pointed out, an approved laboratory. And to think that samples went missing at various stages that are unaccounted for. Like, if I as a farmer, or Dan Brennan as a farmer, were to make those type of mistakes in our normal farming activity with regard to anything to do with our single farm payment or anything that we're supposed to be accountable for, we would be heftily fined under cross compliance. Now, where is the justice for an individual farmer like Dan Brennan, who all he wants to do is get on with his everyday business, and this has cost him not only thousands, but I would say in the region of hundreds of thousands in the last 10 to 15 years, what has been happening on his farm. So I don't know a lot about the joint research committee that's been proposed here today, or any of the other. I know about the European Food Safety Authority, all right. But one thing that I think we must insist on is that Dan and his professional people that have been helping him have a proper input into the deliberations of whatever group is to investigate this, because I think it needs to be taken to another level at this stage. There's not much point in us coming here anymore without some progress being made in this whole issue. But I think that the report that has been drafted, which conveniently ignored a lot of facts, has to be withdrawn, because it is an absolute insult to Dan Brennan and his family that a professional people can sit there and so conveniently ignore facts and put it down as a report. And like Mr. Crilly interrupted a man from the Commission there when he was talking about facts up to 2006. He was supplied with information right up to 2008 and 2009, and it appeared that the Commission is ignoring that now as well. Thank you very much.
Dau cuvântul doamnei Miranda.
Thank you, Miranda.
Presidenta, este no es un caso aislado, es un caso paradigmático. Yo vengo.
Well, this is an interesting case. I'm from a dairy country like Ireland is, and often you don't get enough proof from ministers when you look at the opposition between the weak and the strong. Now, we support the petition, and there are many arguments in support of this. Firstly, the reference to the lack of transparency, reference to the lack and ignorance regarding proof, errors in this is to do with partial scientific studies, not independent ones at the behest of MEPs. This is quite appropriate, and I think we have to look at the human factor as well. 6 years are long for a farm. 6 years is a lot of time for human health, a lot of time for animal health too, and particularly given that this is to do with the petitioner supplying proof. The Commission says about the last reply from the 26th of October where there are shortfalls in terms of permits and so on. This doesn't look like enough of an argument to me, and I think that this should be looked at in greater depth. And we also think that the directives, when applied by Member States, they should be applied rigorously, and in the report there's evidence of that not happening. Now, another argument used by the Irish government is to do with a lack of minerals in the diet. Now, this reference to the proof and normal illnesses. Who says what's normal apart from a farmer? They're the only person that know that live alongside the animals and see them every day. So I think this is a bit partial in terms of the information. So we support this petition.
Muchas gracias, señora Miranda.
Thank you, Ms. Miranda.
Now to Mrs. Wertmann.
Ja, danke schön. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, by way of an introduction, let me tell you I come from Austria. We have a mountainous country. We have a lot of agriculture. Today, we're talking about heavy metals and about the ramifications thereof, and the fact that we have to discuss that at all is quite shocking. You know, when I was a little girl, when I was maybe 6 or 7, we're talking about the 70s, the impact of heavy metals on human beings and on animals, that's something we've known about since then. So there's no hesitation in my mind at all. I have to support the petitioner. It seems to me that what we need is a completely independent and transparent investigation. It's absolutely shocking that in this day and age in Europe we still have this kind of situation. It's incomprehensible as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, that's the state of affairs. There's the question of cost, reimbursement of costs for the petitioner. You know, he's taking care of his farm, of agriculture. You know, I don't know much about farming necessarily, but I understand from what I've heard from the other speakers that this is a good farmer we're talking about here. So please, let's just take note of that. You know, he cares about his animals. He cares about what's happening on his farm. You know, we all have families. We know our family members. This farmer knows his farm animals. They're his family, if you like. He's aware of what's in their best interest, you know, whether they're ill, what would be normal for them, what would be right for them, and what's not right for them. The fact that we're discussing this at all is a problem. So please, let's organise an independent investigation. Reimbursement of costs, yes, that's something we need to discuss, of course we do. And also, please leave this petition open. I really want it to remain open until we have all the facts and 100% clarification of all the facts. I want this all to be cleared up because I don't want anybody coming back and making any kind of comment subsequently. Thank you.
Ne întoarcem la reprezentantul Comisiei, domnul.
Thank you. Well, let's return then to the Commission representative, Mr. Andrew.
I think in terms of providing a response is really with regards to a further independent investigation. I find myself in a rather difficult situation in terms of what I can or cannot commit to from a Commission perspective at this point in time. I think it's something that we can investigate, but it's difficult to make a firm commitment as to which agency might review, which part of the Commission might review. But I hear from the petitioner himself, from his representatives, from others within the room, that there is a desire for some form of investigation to take place. That seems more focused on the information with regards to the cadmium levels within the animals themselves, from what I've gathered, rather than necessarily the brick factory itself. But, as I say, in terms of making a commitment, in terms of further looking at how that might be taken forward, then I think that within my remit, that's about as far as I can go right now.
Dau cuvântul acum petiționarilor. Cine mai are ceva?
Thank you. Well, the petitioners, you have the floor if you have anything to add.
I just want to bring...
Microphone.
Sorry. Am I speaking? Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I just want to bring the focus back to what happened here. And let's not lose sight of the animals. A huge number of animals were suffering. And the whole focus of the investigation of the authorities was on proving that a brick factory didn't cause it. Now, we could all see that the farm was affected because of the environment on the farm. Members of this committee came to the farm and saw that with their own eyes. They saw the animals suffering. And I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that the recommendations at the end of all these reports from the authorities is basically just saying it wasn't the factory, so we're off, bye-bye. But the fact is that those animals were left to suffer. At the time they walked away, the animals were still suffering. Now, the factory closed, and thank God, the production on the farm and everything has improved, and improved significantly. But it was an extraordinary event whereby the authorities come
on the mic.
Because you don't push the micro.
Is it on? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me now? I'm very sorry. I leave it at that, but what I will say is that if an independent investigation is going to take place, the scientific one, please allow all the information to come before that body, because there's a huge amount of information that was ignored and was left out of those reports that is highly relevant and needs to be looked at. That's all I'd ask. Thank you.
I just possibly like to ask the Commission that subsequent to the last meeting, we did send them files, EPA public access files on the emissions from the brick factory up to it closed in October 2000 and it closed in December 2008. The last monitoring event was in October 2000. They turned themselves off. In November 2007 and October 2008, we provided them with information showing multiple breaches, non-compliance with fluoride emissions. And for some reason, in their response to the committee, they only took the data up to 2006. The new legislation only came in October 2007. We showed them breaches in November 2007 and October 2008. And why they did not address those two multiple breaches. We're talking about out of 380 monitoring events, 370 were in breach of fluoride emissions. And I personally emailed that information to Mr McAndrew, and I personally got that information from the EPA public access files. There's something going on here that we don't know about.
Din partea petiționarilor mai dorește cineva să intervină?
Thank you. Would any of the other petitioners like to take the floor at all?
Da, doamnă McGuinness.
I'd like to ask Mr McAndrew to answer that point that Mr Crilly has just made, please. Why has he ignored the information that was sent to him? Like, 370 breaches out of 380 monitoring events. Is somebody here trying to say that that's not significant?
Doamnă McGuinness.
I'll just intervene because I do think I'd like to hear from Mr Brennan, because there is a proposal. I mean, on the issue of the scientific confusion and clash between the Commission and the experts, this is the stuff which has to be teased out at another level. And I do appreciate there are very serious questions that have been raised, but I would like to ask the petitioner, is he supportive of the view from the members, which is that we keep this petition open and that we refer it to the most appropriate scientific body, subject to us getting some guidance from the Commission on that? I think we owe it to Mr Brennan to move this on, not to keep stirring it. Thank you.
După această dezbatere, consider că petiția...
Thank you very much. Well, having listened to the debate, I would conclude that the petition shall remain open, and I suggest that we look into all the documents in detail, documents that have been advanced by both parties. We need to make sure that once we've analysed all the different reports, the coordinators of this committee come together and take the best possible solution, the best decision. And we will also be asking the European Commission to independently assess the situation through the Joint Research Council. Very well. Let us move on then. Move on to item 16 on our agenda. Here we have 6 petitions. They all have to do with the protection of migrant birds in Italy, France, Belgium, Germany, Ireland. It's petition 798 of 2004, 334 of 2005, 886 of 2005, 530 of 2006, 1091 of 2007 and 1374 of 2010. And we give the floor, without further ado, to the petitioner, Mr. Jean-Claude Daumont, and that's on behalf of the Belgian Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. In 2005, 196 people signed up to our petition, and many of them were also from Malta, 340, and we were asking for European legislation to be applied, the legislation in force which Malta has to respect. But since 2005, hardly anything has changed. We were talking about a transitional period for Malta, so that Malta could abide by the Birds Directive, and that came to an end in 2008. Now we are in 2012. The first report on the implementation of the requirements from that transitional period apparently is now being finalised, so we're told. But the Commission has still not received the actual text. So exactly who are we kidding here? It would appear that Malta has absolutely no intention or no will to put an end to the massacre, the slaughter of these migratory birds. They're just trying to gain time to make Maltese hunters happy. So there's been an extermination of indigenous birds in Malta, but in addition to that, protected birds from elsewhere in Europe have been killed too. Birds are part of our common heritage.